Good morning, everyone. It is a distinct pleasure to welcome you all to our Brookings Institution event today on Pakistan, its internal dynamics and changing role in the world. I am Madiha Afzal, and I am a fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. I am part of its Center for Middle East Policy, as well as its Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology. I am thrilled to be joined today by two fantastic speakers. First, my Brookings colleague, Bruce Riedel, who's a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program, also part of its Center for Middle East Policy and Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology. Bruce is the author of many books, including on Pakistan, most recently his book, Beirut 1958, on how America's wars in the Middle East began. Bruce joined Brookings in 2006 after a long, distinguished career in the US government. He was a senior advisor on South Asia and the Middle East to 4 presidents in the staff of the National Security Council at the White House. Bruce was also the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense on Near East and South Asia at the Pentagon. Declan Walsh joins us from the New York Times, where he is currently the Chief Africa Correspondent based in Kenya. But for a very crucial decade, from 2004 to 2003, he was stationed in Pakistan. He covered Pakistan until 2015, most recently as the New York Times Pakistan bureau chief, but he was also with The Guardian in the initial years that he was in Pakistan. Declan has written a new book titled The 9 Lives of Pakistan. I have it here. It's a great new book, which really adds color to a picture of Pakistan that we don't often see. He both, illustrates the time that he was in Pakistan and covering it, but also its history through covering 9 key figures and their lives. And in so doing, he paints a really 3-dimensional picture of the country, introducing Pakistan's many sort of contradictions and various facets to an audience. So we're again thrilled to be having this discussion today. So, just very briefly, by way of introduction, Pakistan's importance is hard to overstate. It's a country of 220 million people, the 5th largest country in the world, of course, known for the fact that it has nuclear weapons, known for its geostrategic position, nestled as it is between India and Afghanistan. It is also a country of brilliant talent, art, architecture, a rich cultural history, though it is not often in the news for those reasons, and not known necessarily in the world for those reasons today. It's also a country of many contradictions. For a long time, Pakistan has been defined by its struggle with terrorism and extremism. Of course, tens of thousands of Pakistanis died in that crucial decade. In fact, that Declan covered Pakistan. Tens of thousands of Pakistanis died until a Pakistani army operation took out and routed the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which was responsible for many of these attacks. But the question of extremism and terrorism, though Pakistan is eager to move past it, is not something that goes away easily in Pakistan. In recent months, the TTP, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, has been resurfacing. Just in the last few days, ISIS has claimed an attack on Hazara, which is an ethnic minority in Balochistan, Hazara coal miners, 11 of whom were killed in Balochistan. So the question of extremism and terrorism never quite goes far away in Pakistan. Pakistan is also a country that has a very young population. 64% of Pakistanis are under 30 years old. In recent years, Pakistan's sort of the discussion in Pakistan has been sort of taken over in some sense by internal politics in the country. And that is something we'll be discussing today. With the election of Imran Khan in July 2018, internal politics and the political dynamics, civil-military relations have really taken center stage in the country. But in the US, we are still looking at Pakistan through the lens of the Afghan peace process, which is, of course, sort of central here as America seeks to wind down its war in Afghanistan. Today in our discussion, we want to sort of re-examine the country at the cusp of the Biden presidency, both looking at its internal domestic politics, where we'll start the discussion, as I said, before moving on to the US-Pakistan relationship, and then discussing Pakistan's relationships with countries in its immediate neighborhood, and then looking at the Middle East. We'll turn at the end to your questions, some of which we've already received, but please feel free to send in your questions. Feel free to join the conversation with the hashtag USPakistan on Twitter, and we'll leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end for those questions. We will begin the discussion now, as I said, with a discussion of sort of politics and civil-military relations in Pakistan. It's easy to be cynical about Pakistani politics. You know, it's defined, I would say, in many ways by a recurring cast of characters that does not necessarily inspire much confidence, what with their varying degrees of incompetence, corruption, subservience to the military, some degrees of intolerance in some of them. And there's been an inability of Pakistan's various civilian governments, as well as military governments in the end, to deliver to their citizens, both in terms of development and growth. So thinking just about Pakistan's GDP growth rate last year in 2019, it was just 1 to 2%, sort of very stagnant growth rates. The discussion on civil-military relations in Pakistan always sort of comes out, regardless of whether the military is overtly in power or not. The fact remains that it remains the most dominant institution in the country, and Pakistani politics remains dysfunctional, essentially, with sort of an unstable democracy and weak civilian parties, though civilian governments have been able to complete their full terms in office. No prime minister has still completed a full term in office of 5 years. We'll wait to see if Imran Khan becomes the first prime minister to do so. Yet there are some interesting trends to note. The military is not in overt power, as I said. One could argue it has perfected the art of control without power, and that it is in a stronger position now than it was post Musharraf's time in 2008. There are a few new actors on the horizon, including ethnic movements like the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, Islamist movements like the TLP, the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, and most recently, the Pakistan Democratic Movement, an alliance of 11 parties, which wants to oust Imran Khan's government and argues against the military's dominance of Pakistan's politics. So I will turn now to both Declan and Bruce. First to Declan, with sort of a very broad question about what you think is different or the same about civil-military relations currently in Pakistan relative to the past. What you would say about the state of Pakistan's politics and the government of Imran Khan in comparison to the previous couple of decades that you covered. Over to you. Declan, you're muted.
Apologies. Thanks very much for that great introduction. One of the things that really strikes me now, as you said, is that this is a period of civilian rule. It's a period when the country has gone through an unprecedented run of elections, passing these milestones that you noted of governments completing their terms and handing over power and so on. And at the same time, I see that the military, in some respects, has greater control now over certain things than they did, I would argue, even under Musharraf. I mean, when I was based in Pakistan for that period between the mid-2000s and 2013, 2014, at that point, for instance, in terms of the press, there was a very vigorous debate. There was a lot of criticism. There was, very strong criticism, of course, after the Osama bin Laden incident. But even when Musharraf himself was in power, and the the press, particularly the TV stations, were vociferous in their criticism of on many subjects. Of course, there were certain red lines as ever, but on the whole, one of the really striking things about the country at that time was that even though you had a military ruler, there was a great deal of debate about what was going on. And of course, at that time, a lot was going on. And now I see, talking to colleagues, seeing what's going on in the country, seeing television chat shows being cut off midstream, journalists being abducted in the middle of Islamabad and, in broad daylight by the security forces. Not to mention, of course, countless reporters in less visible parts of the country, some of whom have been killed in mysterious circumstances. And so, I see that the military, that's just one aspect, but in terms of the press, the military is certainly very dominant right now. And really since 2011, I would say, or 2013, has made this very concerted effort to control the narrative about the country. The military had gone through this period of great embarrassments and humiliations with the Taliban insurgency, the American operation against bin Laden, which raised more questions than the military could answer. And so there was a real sense that they needed to control the narrative, the story the Pakistanis told themselves. Similarly, you asked about the Imran Khan government. This is a government that on the paper should be quite a strong civilian government, and yet in my sense is that it has maintained its strength by ceding control of key policy decisions to the military. A bad policy in Afghanistan, about the posture towards India, obviously control of the nuclear weapons. I think nobody would really ever claim that the civilians enjoy control over that, over Pakistan. So you see, that leaves Imran Khan in control of a very anemic, even ailing economy. Of course, dealing with matters that government should be concerned with, like the response to COVID and so on. But, I don't see a civilian government that, despite the authority it should project, is either able or willing to wield that authority. And so that seems to be a case where we've seen, of course, advances, and there's a danger in the West that we get a little bit sometimes too caught up in the importance of elections as a marker of development, of democratic development and strength. But we still see many of those same institutional flaws. We see the imbalance. And of course, we see, these structural problems inside Pakistani democracy that have made the civilian political class so weak, partly, of course, through people's own doing. And there's a whole host of complicated reasons for that. Parliamentarians who come from feudal backgrounds, endemic corruption. There's no understating all of those things. But by the same token, you also see a political class that, has struggles to assert itself. And I remember when I was even in the country, I noticed that, if you wanted to get elected from most parts of the country, you had to spend money. And so many politicians, I think, they felt that you had to spend money to get elected. When you get elected, you've got to make that money back. That's not to excuse things like corruption, but it's to point out that there are, I think, under the surface, some real structural issues that challenge the development, the emergence of a strong democracy, some of which are to do with the balance of power, others are to do with these other factors.
Excellent. Thanks for that great introduction. Bruce, I'll turn over to you for sort of the same question. What would you say is different or the same about civil military relations, Pakistan's politics, the government of Imran Khan, and so on?
Madiha, thank you for that great introduction. I want to underscore a point that you made at the beginning about Pakistan. This is an incredibly important country, the fifth largest in the world, the second largest Muslim country in the world, the only Muslim country with nuclear weapons. We often in the United States look at Pakistan through the eyes of its neighbors, India, Iran, Afghanistan, which tends to diminish its importance. We should look at it as stand-alone power, a very important country in that regard. And that's where I want to pivot to the issue of democracy and civil military relations. As both you and Declan have rightly pointed out, Pakistan's democracy has enormous flaws. The military plays an extraordinary role. It has ever since independence. The press has been muzzled in the last several years. I remember the morning after the field raid in Abbottabad, the Pakistani press was already running articles saying the military had to know he was hiding there. The American press wasn't writing those articles yet. They came much, much later. The Pakistanis were right off the block on that. You don't see that kind of thing anymore. It is a much more muzzled press. And in many ways, Imran Khan has become a protege of the military. It's quite ironic because Nawaz Sharif was once the protege of the military. The lesson that Imran Khan should remember from that is it's hard to stay the protege of the Pakistani military forever. But let me just step back for 1 minute and say this. With all these flaws, let's do a little comparison shopping. Today, in our country, we have had 2 out of the past 5 elections. The winner of the popular vote was not elected president. The current incumbent lost this election by more than 3 million votes in 2016, and yet he's president of the United States. And today he is challenging the results of an election that he lost again by 7 million votes. Now you can say, okay, Donald Trump is a one-off, but he's not. The majority of the Republican Party is supporting him in trying to overthrow the result of an election. Comparison. Pakistan, since 2008, power has transitioned from the Bhuttos to the Sharifs to Imran Khan. It was never seamless. It was never beautiful. It was never perfect, but it happened. It's an important comparison to make. Civil-military relations. Yesterday, the Washington Post published a letter signed by the 10 alive secretaries of defense saying that the military has no role in American politics. Why did they publish the letter? Why did the 10 secretaries of defense led by, of all people, Dick Cheney, feel that they had to stand out and say something about civil-military relationships? Let's comparison shop just a little bit more broadly. What other major Muslim country in the Middle East and South Asia has democratic elections? None. Turkey is about as close as you can get. Some people would argue Iran, but of course Iran, you can only run if you were approved by the clerical authority. But Pakistan's contribution, its exceptionalism in this regard is really quite noteworthy. And I'm just going to finish on this point. With all the flaws that Pakistani democracy has, Pakistan is probably the only major American ally in the Middle East that is a Muslim country, aside from Turkey, that genuinely should be invited to President-elect Joe Biden's upcoming summit of democracies. It will be invited not with an A+ grade, but by comparison with its neighbors, at least it's in the running. You certainly wouldn't put Egypt, Saudi Arabia, or most of the Turkestans in that right. So a little bit of comparison shopping. It's interesting to see how Pakistan fares when you look at it in that regard. Let me finish there.
Excellent. And Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan, in his tweet congratulating Joe Biden and Kamala Harris for winning the election, talked about that global summit on democracy in the very first tweet to them. So that's a really important thing to bring up. There's one more question I want to ask about sort of internal dynamics, and perhaps it's a 2-part question before moving to US-Pakistan relations. are there elements in Pakistan, if you think about civil society, the youth, Pakistan's women, a political movement or an alliance of parties, that gives you hope for change in its democracy and politics in a positive direction? And not just that, its democracy and politics sustains as it is, but that it becomes more functional and delivers results to its citizens. So better governance, if you will. So, the first part is there a part of Pakistani society that gives you hope? The second is, what part is a cause for concern? And again, Declan, why don't we start with you, and then Bruce will come to you.
Sure. Well, look, I mean, the parts of Pakistani society that give rise to hope. There's nothing new about that. I mean, those sections in society, those people who are there, they've I met plenty when I was there. They've been there for a very long time. The trouble is that the barriers to entry into vehicles or the political system where they can start to affect those changes. I mean, I remember when I lived in Pakistan, I knew people who were incredibly patriotic and capable and who wanted to participate in government, but felt that they would have to make a lot of very personal and sometimes moral compromises to participate in that system. And I'm not sure that I see the necessary changes in the system to allow those people access just yet. I mean, when Imran Khan was rising to power when his popularity was rising, really in the run-up to the 2013 election initially, of course, he appealed to young people for a host of reasons, including some of his stances against drones. He evoked a certain new kind of patriotism in young people, a reason to be proud. And of course, he was glamorous, spoke against dynamism, the dynastic families, and all of that. But, I think also he capitalized on this wave of frustrated, disaffected young people, particularly in the towns, who wanted something to catch on to. And I'm not in Pakistan right now, so really, my sense of this, I would say, is highly qualified. But I think, even for the most ardent supporters of Imran Khan's government would probably concede, at least privately, that, he has not yet delivered on the hopes of those young people. But it's not just, of course, about the mainstream parties. I saw the emergence in recent years of the PTM movement. Again, young Pashtuns rising from some of the most marginalized and war-torn parts of the country in the tribal belt and asserting their civil rights and also asserting their identity. Here's this group that, after 2001 was broadly seen, not just in the international community, but also in parts of Pakistani society as being either, terrorists or victims of terrorism. And here's this group, this movement that's come forward where people are reaching for a Pashtun identity that speaks to, a very different set of values, a very different political and cultural history. But again, this movement, because it is seen as a challenge to the power at the center, has been suppressed, at least in the media. And of course, some of their people have ended up in jail as well. So I'm not sure that I see emergent winners, but I see that, and this is really the thing about Pakistan that I think is most heartening, and it goes a little bit to Bruce's point about the difference between Pakistan and particularly Muslim majority countries in the Middle East, is that you see that the game is on, that these ideas are contested, that young people and older people are willing to rise and to assert themselves, to try and fight for a higher ideal. So for me, that is the most hopeful thing, I would say.
Great, Bruce, over to you.
I think I completely agree with Declan on this about young people. But I would also make a gender statement. What gives me great hope about Pakistan is Pakistani women. Benazir Bhutto is, of course, the most famous. And you can argue that she got her position because being in part of a political dynasty. That's not that unusual. Hillary, after all, that's often the way that people get put forward. But she did provide a level of leadership, both in government, and I would say even more importantly, when she was in opposition and in exile. That was quite important for Pakistan. And the tragedy of her assassination was a real epic moment in the country. We will all wonder endlessly what Pakistan would have been like if Benazir had been able to go for a few years. She's not alone. There are lots of other women in Pakistan, Fari Rahman, for example, who have demonstrated leadership in the face of not just adversity, but in the face of being threatened with being murdered. That's not something that, thankfully, American politicians don't operate in that kind of environment. So the women of Pakistan, not just the leaders, but the rank and file, get out and vote. And here the comparison again, Saudi Arabia. Does anyone know who the Queen of Saudi Arabia is? We have no idea. Egypt, and of course ourselves. In a few weeks, hopefully, we will for the first time have a woman vice president after 200 plus years of our democracy. We have a long way to go to catch up in that regard. What do I worry about? 3 initials, the ISI. The Pakistani intelligence service, I happen to know quite well. Declan knows them quite well as well in a different way. They are ruthless, they are powerful, and they are a state sponsor of terrorism. By any definition of what a state sponsor of terrorism is, the Pakistani intelligence service is one. Its involvement in attacks like the Mumbai terrorist attack back in 2008, but also much more recent events. And its relationship with the Afghan Taliban, which is intimate, complete, from providing sanctuary and safe haven to having a voice on the Shura Council of the Afghan Taliban, actually directing its highest levels. The good news is we have seen in the last couple of weeks a few steps to rein in some of its previous supporters, particularly in Lashkar-e-Taiba. We can all be very cynical about this, and for good reason. We've been around this before, but Hafiz Saeed has been in jail now for months and months and months. It's a little bit of a change. We got a long, long way to go, but it's worth noting that we have had this change in a positive direction. So that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Excellent. I agree with both of you on the potential for positive change and the hope. I would just add in sort of the cause for concern. I've studied Pakistan's relationship with extremism and sort of the root causes of extremism, and there was some clarity that came after the Army Public School attack of 2014, of December 2014, in terms of Pakistan's National Action Plan and sort of figuring out the root causes of extremism. Not a complete clarity, but some. And I fear that in recent years, especially in the last couple of years, that has been lost. And so the root the root cause of extremism that I've outlined: Pakistan's education system, problems in Pakistan's laws, the way politics is structured, the power given to Islamist parties, even though they don't have electoral power. All of that remains the same. In some sense, all of those things have only been solidified in the last couple of years. There's finger pointing, to account for terrorist attacks rather than looking within at what accounts for people turning to extremism and terrorism. So that worries me. But we will now move to talking about US-Pakistan relations. And of course, again, with Inauguration Day coming up in just 15 days, it's crucially important to look at what we might expect of the US-Pakistan relationship under a Biden presidency. Is it going to be a reversion to the Obama years, or will there be something different? Just a couple of points before I turn over to you, Bruce. In some sense, the relationship with the U.S., Pakistan's relationship with the United States has been defined in many ways through Afghanistan, and then and as well as through India. In the Trump years, the relationship saw a low point, but then since then has moved up in the last couple of years. It's become very transactional, though, but some things have worked, in particular related to the Afghan peace process that you started talking about, Bruce, as well as the Financial Action Task Force gray listing that Pakistan has had, has led to it taking action on the Lashkar-e-Taiba, in particular Hafiz Saeed, as well as other Lashkar-e-Taiba leaders. So I wonder, Bruce, if you could talk a little bit about, if you want to look at a retrospective in some sense of the Trump years, but looking ahead, where you see the relationship going in the Biden administration.
Certainly. The US-Pakistani relationship, going right back to the beginnings, has been a roller coaster. We have moments of incredible highs and moments of incredible lows. No country, I think, in the world, the possible exception of Iran, has been sanctioned by the United States more than Pakistan, and certainly with no effective result. I remember at one point at the end of the Clinton administration, there were so many sanctions on Pakistan that our lawyers basically couldn't figure out how you could strip them all off. There was just such a complex web of sanctions. The other thing that's striking about it is that, by and large, the highs have always come when Pakistan had a military dictator, not when it had a democratically elected president. My favorite example of this is Jimmy Carter and Zia ul-Haq. You would have thought that the president who introduced the idea of human rights into American foreign policy would not be able to work with General Zia, but in the end they worked together quite effectively and set up the program that led to the demise of the Soviet Union and the victory of the Mujahideen. The Trump years have been a kind of shortened version of the roller coaster. The Trump administration started off with very, very biting criticism of Pakistan. Perhaps the most succinct criticism we have ever seen an American administration give about Pakistan, and particularly its role in terrorism. And then Imran Khan was elected, and the Trump administration pivoted from being the most critical country of Pakistan to being one of its biggest supporters. The iconic image of Donald Trump sitting in the White House saying that he's prepared to mediate between India and Pakistan on Kashmir, and Imran Khan virtually falls out of his chair when he hears him say it, is one of the most striking images I've ever seen of a presidential interview with a foreign head of state. Now, of course, he never did. A lot of this was all talk. It didn't really turn into anything. But the Trump administration did turn to Pakistan, particularly for help with the Afghan negotiations. I won't call them peace talks, because Afghanistan is certainly not anywhere near peace. You could argue it's more violent today than it has been at any time in the last 20 years. But the Trump administration did recognize the importance of Pakistan in Afghanistan. Turning to Joe Biden. Joe Biden knows Pakistan very, very well. It's sobering to realize that Joe Biden now has been in the federal government in an elected role for 45 of the last 49 years. And he has visited Pakistan very often. Pakistan was, in fact, the last country he visited before he gave up his role in the Senate in 2009. And he went to a very, very important point. This was right after the Mumbai attacks. This was right as the United States was beginning to examine its Afghanistan policy. There was a vivid demonstration that Joe Biden understands that if you want to deal with Afghanistan, the proper address to start is Pakistan. And he is very much understanding of the fact that Af-Pak, a term I hate to use, should actually be Pak-Af, which would be an equally horrible term to use. The right address is to go to Pakistan. One last thing I would say about the relationship is we've tried everything over the years. As I said, we've sanctioned Pakistan for everything. We've also tried to buy Pakistan with tremendous offers of assistance, never as much as Pakistanis thought they needed, but quite a large amount of money by comparison terms to American foreign assistance or military assistance to other countries. I know the issue of how good the equipment we've given Pakistan is in Pakistani eyes, but it's nonetheless quite substantial military equipment. None of it's worked. Whether it's sanctioning or trying to buy Pakistan, it hasn't worked. And I think Joe Biden faces quite a challenge as we look forward. How is he going to be able to persuade Pakistani government to help us reach a stage where we can leave Afghanistan confident that we are leaving something better than that which we went into change in 2002.
Thanks, Bruce. That was great. Declan, I'll turn to you now on sort of the same question, including if you would like to talk a little bit about how you see Pakistanis viewing the US-Pakistan relationship, especially when you were there, and sort of in some ways, you know, what does Pakistan want from the US and from its relationship with the US?
Well, I think that, you know, this moment, the incoming Biden administration really offers a really potentially important moment for both countries to recalibrate their own expectations of this very, as Bruce says, very troubled relationship over the decades. You know, the Americans have tried to punish Pakistan. They've tried to bribe or to buy their way Pakistani affections. And I think if you were to reach one takeaway from that, it would be that, you know, I think the Americans always sought to change. They thought that they could influence Pakistan's strategic calculus about Afghanistan, about India, and even at the height of the Musharraf years, when America was pouring money into Pakistan, America had great influence over the country, the Pakistanis were still effectively running their own policy in regard to Afghanistan and so on. And so, you know, it was this really stark illustration that American power, you know, short of declaring war, has severe limits. And I think Pakistan has proven, you know, the extent of those limits. And I think that there's an opportunity at this moment for the United States to look at Pakistan, as you said, not just through, as it has always, through the lens of Afghanistan in particular, but on its own terms, as this, you know, it's a country that's a medium power. It has all of the potential that we've talked about here earlier on in this discussion. It's geostrategically located, and that, you know, if there were an opportunity, and this is what I think one would pray for, if there was an opportunity to engage with Pakistan on those terms for Washington, it could actually be a process that would have more realistic expectations and more measurable results. But to get to your question, there's also a recalibration that has to take part on the part of the Pakistanis. If the, you know, process in Afghanistan, difficult as it is, does result in, at the very least, an American withdrawal, a full American withdrawal, whatever place that the Taliban have in that future, you know, you see that one of the great points of leverage for the Pakistanis over the last couple of decades has, of course, been their ability, actually, paradoxically, to influence the Taliban. You know, without that, part of their power would be a lot less. And we've even seen recently, the Pakistanis not actually being able to always deliver with the Taliban. They bring the Taliban to the table, and then the Taliban often very obstinately do their own thing. And so, you know, for me, that's an indication that for, if you like, Pakistan's strategic planners, it shows that Pakistan's importance, you know, as a fulcrum, as a key element of solving this huge problem of Afghanistan, is probably going to diminish in future. And so, you know, their ability to command attention in Washington is going to be, I suspect, diminished. And I think Pakistanis need to ask themselves the question, why will the Biden administration particularly care about Pakistan? There are so many other things going on in the world. There's a limited amount of time. And, you know, if you ask me about the period when I was there, you know, Pakistan really was a huge, and Bruce will speak to this, you know, an intense center of American attention. Pakistani diplomats and ambassadors and so on, army chiefs would go to Washington. When I was based in Islamabad, I can't count how many visits there were by the head of the CIA, Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of that. I mean, I can't remember the last time there was, for instance, a CIA head level visit to Pakistan. I'm not sure how often the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff visit Pakistan anymore. And so, you know, you see that Pakistanis also have to recalibrate to this world in which they will have to, perhaps, rather than, you know, expect that this relationship, I often got the impression that the Pakistanis, in return for the cooperation they offered the Americans, you know, they wanted blind support. If the Americans misunderstood the Pakistanis' strategic calculation, or if they wanted to change it naively, the Pakistanis also felt often wounded that the Americans were not giving them what they wanted if it came to India, for instance, or think Kashmir, issues like that. And, you know, Donald Trump pandered to that idea but didn't deliver. But I think, you know, Pakistanis also have had unrealistic expectations from the relationship down the years. And they've often said one thing and done another, to the immense frustration of foreign allies and partners. And so, you know, I think at this juncture, they will also have to think hard about how they can, frankly, how they can command the attention of the Biden administration, and particularly to position themselves in a world in which, you know, the American relationship with India has gone from strength to strength, and Pakistan's alliance with China is both a strength, but it's also, of course, seen as a threat to the Americans.
Excellent, and you know, as everyone can see, we can't talk about the Pakistan-U.S. relationship without talking about Afghanistan, without talking about India, and without talking, of course, about China. So I'll turn actually to India and Afghanistan next. Perhaps India first. Where do you know, the relationship, I would argue, is at a low. Where do you both see the relationship going? In some ways, you know, I think the post the Pulwama attack of February 2019, so a couple of years ago now, and then after the revocation of India's revocation of Kashmir's autonomy, the relationship has been at a low. Pakistanis, India often pointed the finger at Pakistan for intolerance within Pakistan, but in some sense, the rising amounts of intolerance in India has many Pakistanis giving sort of a retroactive justification for the reason that Pakistan had to come into existence. And so, the specter of partition comes back. The shadow of partition is never far away from the discussion of India and Pakistan. So where do you see that relationship going? Briefly, if both of you could talk about that, and then to Afghanistan. Intra-Afghan peace talks resumed today after a break. Zalmay Khalilzad was in Pakistan again yesterday, making his umpteenth visit to the country. Pakistan and Afghanistan's relationship has been characterized by mistrust over the years. Pakistan has just announced that the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan is almost completely fenced. Yet there are some, there's been some rapprochement between the Kabul government and Imran Khan's government in recent months. So we'll turn to that Afghanistan relationship, but first the relationship with India. And Declan, I'll start with you, and then Bruce, perhaps we could go to you for India and Afghanistan, and then Declan, back to you. And then we'll turn to audience questions in about 5 minutes.
Thanks. So, the India relationship obviously is in a pretty parlous state. But there have been these incidents in Kashmir, and of course there's always the danger you've got these two nuclear armed nations facing off against each other. But to be perfectly honest, for all of that, I'm not sure that I see any imminent signs that there's going to be a conflict between these two countries. The nuclear deterrent, I think, is that actually in the case of Pakistan and India. Both sides know that were they to use these weapons, despite the ever-present danger that it could happen, I think both sides know that they would face mutual destruction. So, I see a situation of stasis and degradation in the relationship with India. But also, it's so interesting you mentioned this position about Pakistanis seeing a sort of retrospective justification for the creation of their country. And I wrote about this a little bit in the book, actually, because I totally agree with that. I've really started to sense in recent years that, particularly under Modi, that people are looking across the border at what's been happening with Muslims in India. And when I was in Pakistan, my friends, progressive Pakistanis, talking about Jinnah and the history, generally very appreciative and praising of Jinnah as a person and of course as the creation of the country, but quietly dismissive of the two-nation theory, the idea that Muslims and Hindus couldn't live together. And people would sort of quietly dismiss that. Now I see many of those same people looking at what's happening and thinking, well, maybe Jinnah had a point. When you look at the politics, the majoritarian politics of India, the discrimination, state-sponsored discrimination against Muslims, you certainly can't fault people, I think, for coming to the conclusion that to some degree those things were right. On the other hand, of course, inside Pakistan, never unfortunately a country to disappoint on the same questions. You look at what happened recently in Curragh in the northwest with a mob destroying a Hindu temple, and you see that, of course, moderation and tolerance is a two-way street, and in both of these countries, unfortunately, these tendencies are coming to the fore. In Pakistan, they've had wrestled with these problems for many years. And now, of course, the most damnable thing you can say about India is that, at least in this respect, it's becoming more like Pakistan. And I think that's really sad.
I'm glad you brought up the temple. I mean, one thing I will say is exactly, that it's just obviously so disappointing and so disheartening that this continues to happen. But the Pakistani state, because it is so concerned with its image, perhaps, and Imran Khan tries to argue that he's moving Pakistan towards tolerance, has taken quite swift action, or is promising to take swift action against the mob that led the charge against the Hindu temple, as well as the cops who just stood by and watched it happen. And so perhaps, just the caring about the image actually makes a difference in terms of the actions of the state. It's there's perhaps a little bit of a silver lining to that obsession with the image, and in particular trying to, in some sense, compare it favorably to India. Bruce, I'll turn to you for India and Afghanistan as well, if you could, please.
Well, like both of you, I'm very troubled by the way the Modi government is moving India. It's quite striking because the first BJP government that we dealt with was very, very careful on these issues, surprisingly careful on these issues. Modi seems to have thrown care to the wind. From a U.S. perspective, Pakistan is always second best, I have to say. Everybody wants to go out with the Indian girl who has so much money and has the constant allure that if we could only sell one pair of sneakers to every Indian, we'd be the richest country in the world. Of course, in reality, they don't buy sneakers, but this constant perception that India is the country of the future hurts Pakistan. And you see it in visits. Declan made a reference to this. American presidents used to always visit both India and Pakistan. Dwight Eisenhower, who was the first president to travel to South Asia, went to both. He actually also went to Kabul. That was the norm for many, many years. It's not the norm anymore. Bill Clinton did go to India and Pakistan. He spent 5 days in India. He spent less than 5 hours in Pakistan. George W. Bush at least spent the night. To the best of my memory, Barack Obama never went to Pakistan unless I've missed something, but he did go to India. Donald Trump never went to Pakistan. It's unfortunate because, as we've all said several times today, Pakistan merits attention on its own merits, not in comparison to India and Pakistan. The situation between the two is dangerous. Pakistan has been able to rally virtually no support over the issue of Kashmir, to the intense frustration of the Pakistani leadership. It certainly rallied no support from the United States government, and I can't believe that a Biden-Harris administration is going to rally much support here. It is deeply troubling that nuclear deterrence seems to have worked. It has created a stalemate in the relationship. I remain concerned, though, about the possibility of miscalculation at some point down the road. This is a fragile basis upon which to build a relationship. I'll just say a couple of words about Afghanistan, particularly knowing Joe Biden. Joe Biden wants to get out of Afghanistan. He has wanted to get out of Afghanistan going back to 2008. In the debates over policy on Afghanistan in the Obama administration, Joe Biden was a consistent minority of one saying we should just leave. But he always left the caveat that we should leave behind a small counterterrorism force of about 2,500, which is about what he's going to inherit now. The problem is that the Taliban are not going to accept that. This is an area where the Taliban's position is very, very clear. All of the Americans need to go. All of the NATO foreign forces need to go. And I think we're going to be heading towards a crisis quite early in the Biden administration. Zal may go, but the deadline that Zal set for the United States leaving is coming in May. And the Taliban are going to argue that part of the deal the United States needs to live up to. Regardless of the fact that the Taliban have lived up to none of the parts of the deal that were required of them, they're going to hold us to that. And it's going to take a lot of effort. Pakistan is going to be crucial in all of this. Can the Pakistanis play a role in persuading the Taliban that that deadline is not fixed? We'll see. This is going to be a very early test for the Biden administration on an issue which I'm sure they would rather not have to deal with.
Great. Yes, absolutely. I mean, Pakistan's importance, I think, at the beginning of the Biden administration remains as it was at the end of the Trump administration. And so, but looking ahead, perhaps in the next couple of years, all of that could change quite a bit if the withdrawal occurs, and then Pakistan has to be dealt with as Pakistan, not Pakistan as it relates to Afghanistan. We have received many great questions. We have actually covered a number of those questions in our discussion. We attempted to have a wide-ranging one. I am going to quickly pose, I'm going to pose two questions. I'll come to you, Bruce, first, then Declan. The first question, and this is something that we have talked about as well, Bruce, is about Pakistan's relationships with the Gulf, in particular thinking about with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Someone in the audience asks about the changing relationship given India's closeness with both. Of course, with the relationship with Saudi Arabia saw a rift given that Pakistan and Pakistan's foreign minister in particular expressed concern that Saudi Arabia has not said more on Kashmir, and Saudi Arabia asked Pakistan to return loans that it had given it. Where do you see that relationship going? So that's the first question. There is a second question about the Pakistani military and our leverage, the U.S. and the West's leverage on the Pakistani military, in particular, its control over politics as well as its relationship with extremist groups. What leverage, if any, does the U.S. And the West have over the Pakistani military? I'll pose both those questions to both of you, and we'll have to be sort of quick, and we'll end around 11.
I'll take the question about the Pakistanis and the Gulf states. Pakistan very wisely in 2015 decided not to join the Saudi war against Yemen. I wish I could say the same about the Obama-Biden administration. Pakistanis refused to send troops. That really was a major disruption in Saudi planning. They had counted on the Pakistanis providing the ground forces. Instead, they stood by the side, and they passed unanimously in the Pakistani parliament a resolution saying they would not send troops. Relationship has soured since then. You mentioned some of the things that have soured it more recent years, Kashmir and others. The Saudis still need Pakistan, and Pakistan still needs Saudi Arabia, but this relationship has transformed quite remarkably in a negative way from what it was. In contrast, India is the market for Saudi oil, and that has become more and more important to them. I'll add just one more country here in the mix, and that's Israel. It's quite interesting how much the question of whether Pakistan will follow the Emiratis and the Bahrainis, etc., in recognizing the state of Israel has come up in the last month. I don't think Pakistan is about to do that, but when you talk about leverage, Pakistan has an interesting new card in its back pocket. Whether it would recognize Pakistan. And if Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim country, recognizes Israel, Pakistan will have some leverage in dealing with the Biden administration what can it get in return for taking this step? What leverage do we have on the Pakistani military? The answer to that question is easy. Zero. Nada.
Excellent. Thanks, Bruce. Declan, over to you, and for any final words as well, and then I'll wrap up at the very end.
I'll just say two quick things. One is, in several of our chats here, this issue of, India as a competitor to Pakistan, whether it be with the Saudis or with the US, is, really is something that's come up. And yesterday when I was talking to someone, I came across a figure that I thought was very striking, that, last year in 2019, US-Pakistan bilateral trade was about $6 billion. American trade with India in the same period was $129 billion. And this year it's forecast to be closer to 150. And I think for any Pakistani, those are pretty sobering figures. The other thing on the issue of leverage, I think, as Bruce says, I think the Americans don't have much leverage, but I think actually the key question is the other way around. It's, what leverage do the Pakistanis have? And I think, certainly the Israel card is a potential card to play, even though if it does turn out that a bunch of countries do recognize Israel, there is going to be first mover advantage. But if you start doing it towards the end of the run, there's going to be a lot less to gain from it. But the other thing I think, and this is just to go back to an earlier point, is I think that Pakistan's leverage is diminishing fast. I think with the end game or some sort of end game in Afghanistan, we're seeing a historical period that started in 1979 with the Russian invasion, not necessarily coming to an end, but coming to an end of a chapter. And this has been a period in which Pakistan, for most of that time, has maintained a lot of leverage, either by helping the Americans or by helping the Taliban or by doing a bit of both. And over the last period. And so I think this is a real strategic challenge for Pakistan. I think they're losing a card in this game, and I think they're going to have to figure out what's going to replace it.
Excellent. Well, thank you to Bruce, Riedel, Declan Walsh for a fantastic, very wide-ranging discussion. Thank you to all in the audience for joining us, for your excellent questions. We were able to get to many things. We could talk about Pakistan, of course, for hours, and hope to reconvene to talk about Pakistan again soon. Thanks very much again.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.